Good evening, everyone. Kalispera ses. Let us first begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I extend our respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. We've entered the second half of this year's seminars program, with still many exciting seminars to come. Thanks, everyone here, for braving the cold. Winter this year has been a bit more acute. Although we're back online for the next 2 weeks, nearly all our August seminars will be at the mezzanine level, and this is something we've really missed in the program, that sort of social dimension that the program used to have in the past. We're trying to rebuild that. And if you do miss any seminars, we normally endeavour within 1 or 2 days to place them online on the community's YouTube channel. My partner in crime, our IT specialist, Kosa Floniti, makes sure of that, and this program wouldn't be possible without Kosa's timely intervention on many occasions. And also a big thank you to Dr. Sofia Avramudas, the sponsor of tonight's seminar. There's still plenty of seminars without sponsors, so we encourage you all to sponsor a seminar of your choice during the rest of the year. Next week's seminar, it's an online seminar by Athens-based Dr. Elena Bouletti on the early years of British administration in Cyprus. And on the question of Cyprus, this week marks the 49th anniversary of the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. Check out the activities organised by SECA. There's also a handout that's on several of the seats there regarding Concert for Cyprus this Sunday at the Super Community, sort of 3 p.m, 495 Logan Street. I think the memorial service at 10 a.m. is at Agios Evstathios, the wreath laying at 12 at the memorial there. So keep an eye on those activities organised by SEC and encourage you all to attend them. But let's return to tonight's topic, literary translation as a political act, transferring post-war narratives from the margins to the mainstream, by Dr. Konstandina Dounis. In the past, Australian history has been punctuated by silences and preferred dominant narratives. One doesn't need to go further than the treatment of Indigenous people, their issues and their realities. The production of historical narratives involves the uneven contribution of competing groups and individuals who have unequal access to the means of such production. The creation and dissemination of history, of historical thoughts, of chronicles and other works can take many forms, one being literary works which become part of a country's national literary canon. In this sphere, there are many absences and silences, one being the absence of working class narratives depicting the actual lived experience of the mass-migratory post-war era. Officially sanctioned historical narratives not containing these works, by either sidelining them or not facilitating their translation into English, means we have a poor understanding of our social-cultural mosaic and its evolution. This is the focus of tonight's speaker, Dr. Konstandina Dounis. She's no stranger to the seminar series and no stranger to many of you in the audience. She's a long-time supporter of the community and its activities and very active in the field of diaspora literature. Her PhD, entitled The Shadow and the Muse, focused on unearthing immigrant women's texts and bringing them to the forefront. She's a recipient of many teaching awards and is presently a lecturer in Faculty of Education at Monash University. Dina, good to have you back again. Welcome to the podium. Big round of applause for our speaker tonight.
Thank you very much. So, is that all right? Yeah. So, translation or literary translation as a political act. Thank you. I would like, in turn, to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and recognise and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I would also, if I may, specifically reference the important work of the William Cooper Institute at Monash University in its tireless efforts to promote Indigenous history, language and culture. They really do a phenomenal job, and I rarely make any reference to Indigenous literature, language or culture unless I run it by them. And they, always steer me in the right direction. So that acknowledgement is really heartfelt. All right. I really like that we begin our presentations with an acknowledgement of country, because it puts us in a frame of mind of gratitude. None of us move in a vacuum. Many individuals contribute to us doing what we do. In that light, I would like to thank the Greek community generally and Nick Dallas specifically for organising these very important seminars for over a decade now. Thank you. Again, this is very heartfelt. Thank you to each and every one of you who have kindly ventured out on a cold winter's night to attend this evening. It's nice to give a presentation, but what I really love is the end, when we can all have a chat about things. Thank you to Nels Cosmos for always supporting us. Likewise, SBS and 3ZZZ, particularly Christos Fifis and Elias Diakolambrianos. Thank you to my family, my husband Christos Avramudas and our daughter Sophia Avramudas, for our discussions that always weave their way into everything I produce. And finally, I would like to welcome Salome Sophocleos and Mimi Sophocleos. They're behind Christofifis, the lovely looking couple there, who are visiting Australia for a short time from Cyprus, where they've been based for around 20 years. They are a formidable couple, but also formidable individually in their respective academic fields. Prior to returning to Cyprus, they lived in Melbourne for over 20 years, during which time Mimi Sophocleos headed, many of you will remember, the Modern Greek Language and Culture Department at RMIT. I was very fortunate to be part of Mimi's lectureship team for some 10 years. I say this with every sincere feeling I can muster, Mimi. Your leadership was filled with vision, with hard work, with music, and always with good humour. I look back on that time and I realise how incredibly fortunate I was to have worked with you. And I'm so happy to see you here tonight. So let's begin on our journey. Translation is and has always been a political act. Literary translation has long been a site of contested interests, both overt and subliminal. As Muhammad al-Bakri, a recent theorist, has postulated, more than a self-contained neutral act of interlingual transfer, translation is a fraught act rooted in specific historical, economic, and socio-cultural contexts, and is particularly sensitive to the politics, broadly conceived, of these contexts. Politics in the wider sense of the term and translation have always been associated. Most reading and writing are produced and conducted in a political context. Translation, the combined act of careful reading and rewriting, is therefore doubly political, Not only was the first text embedded in and influenced by certain political configurations, but the second text, the rewritten version, adds yet another layer of politics, that of the new translating culture and era. That this complexity has been systematically theorised in the last 30 years or so does not negate what I declared above, does not render the associate findings anything new. Like Poe's purloined letter, these findings were always intrinsic to the process and product of translation. Actually, prior to the last few decades, the process of translation was not thought about much at all. It was invariably referred to in pithy terms, always in a mode of denigration. There have been many of these, but the most recent, poetry is what is lost in translation, being a widely disseminated one. Or the collective outlook appeared to be that translations just magically fell down from the sky, somehow completely devoid of socio-cultural influence and disassociated from the position and predisposition of the actual translator. On the other hand, the ultimate product, if we can call it that, of translation certainly resonated at the governmental level. To paraphrase Heilbronn and Sapiro in Politics of Translation, How States Shape Cultural Transfers, and I quote, or paraphrase, state policies shape translation practice regulating... Oh, I beg your pardon. Actually, I think I've got it up. No, I don't. State policies shape translation practice regulating translation flows that encourage as well as discourage translation, providing subsidies, for example, or not providing them, thereby initiating levels of restriction in terms of publishing and export possibilities. State policies with regards to translation are invariably part of the politics to enhance and promote national culture, for dominant powers to strengthen their hegemony or influence, the absolute proliferation of English literature within the context of colonialisation is a glaring example, and I read a fantastic article many years ago, actually, about the ramifications of that in India. And for dominated countries, such as Greece, particularly in the post-war decades, to obtain a certain cultural visibility within the transnational domain. Even the most cursory overview of the post-war Nobel Prize winners amply attests to this. Consider the manifest importance of George Seferis, translated initially by Edmund Keeley and Philip Sherrard, and Odysseus Selitis, translated initially, there have been multiple translations, but initially by Edmund Keeley and George Safidis within this framework. Both extensively translated into English, both subsequently Nobel Prize winners, and both manifestly responsible for the post-war global dissemination of the notion that the modern Greeks, the newly formed Greek state, also had much to contribute to the world of letters. I would love to include here a consideration of one of my favourite poets of all time, Konstandin Cavafy, but my unshakable position is that he is not a Greek poet per se, but a poet of the Greek diaspora. So I'll leave a consideration of his poetry to another seminar in the future. I would, however, like to focus on Nikos Kazantzakis. He was a writer born in Crete, albeit a very conflicted writer where his relationship with his homeland was concerned, a mutually fractious symbiosis between writer and the nation state. a master narrator whose translated works encapsulate with utter clarity the notion expounded above regarding the exportation of books and culture. Indeed, the inextricable alignment of books and culture as an export commodity. The translation of his novel, Vios και Πολιτεία, to Alexis Zorba, the literal translation of which might be The Life and Tumultuous Times of Alexis Zorba, into English, the translation of this into English by Carl Wildman, facilitated its global reach. The further transference into the medium of film resulted in the sensation that was Zorba the Greek. Whether by design or by serendipitous good fortune or by a fortuitous combination of the two, I, by the way, and like many others, have always maintained that Greece rises like the phoenix when you least expect it. This resulted in the construct of the Greek islands in the voluminous audience-goer's perception. Remember, people the world over had just emerged from the horror of the war years, and here was a visual testament to a strangely wild, sort of primordial landscape with a promise of wild passions, the all-engulfing erotic subtext underscored literally by Mikis Theodorakis' musical score. This movie and its music were largely responsible for the advent of tourists converging en masse to the Greek islands. This is all documented. The more remote, the better, with Crete figuring prominently as the lusted after Mecca. Indeed, the first Greek hotel complex unit was created in 1968 in where else? Crete, where Zorba the Greek was set. A fascinating amalgam of literary activity, translation activity, politics and economics. As much as I would love to stay within this focus for longer, as there are so many interesting tangents that can be explored, I would like to redirect our gaze to translation within a different hue. Translation within the diaspora precinct and its associated ramifications within this topic this evening. Let's begin by engaging in what is commonly perceived as a contradiction in terms, the telling of a translated joke from the original Greek to English. Now, my family is sitting there with great trepidation because whereas they are both master joke tellers, I can kill any joke. Give me any joke and it will not be funny. But really, I'm doing this now to show you the sorts of processes that a translator can go through, particularly a literary translator. The joke that follows is a contemporary one that has emerged from the precinct of the Greek diaspora. I expect that it initially emerged from the Greek American diaspora. However, it can be readily incorporated into the Greek Australian domain, given the shared cultural experience of immigration and the centrality of the Greek Orthodox Church. These churches are extremely elaborate structures, and the Byzantine icons alone are very expensive to buy and upkeep. The necessary funds mostly come from the parish communities themselves, collected by a dedicated committee. The priests work unbelievably hard in their fundraising efforts, and the following joke clearly targets those priests who are more zealous than most in these efforts. I have tweaked it a little to suit the geographical landscape here, and I also said told this joke to a couple of priests who are friends. They said that this joke also suggests other things as well. but they liked it very much. Now, I'd like to focus on some of the words that I actually include in this translation. With regards to the word pater, this is a direct transliteration of pater, which is how all parishioners used to address the priest, and by and large still do. It is the ancient Greek word for father. Trisagion is a blessing for the dearly departed. Once again, I have transliterated rather than give a clumsy approximation in English. Also, Kyrie eleison, thanks to the pop song, I don't have to worry about now. Apart from the fact that the context of these words facilitates an understanding of their meanings, I have left the transliterations for two important reasons, both of which meander around the notions of cultural translation. The joke is very much a part of the diasporic experience, and these words add a certain mood that reflects this. A priest in Greece, for example, is unlikely to refer to an Anglican church a few blocks away with the ease that this priest does, simply because such palpable heterogeneity does not feature within Greece's religious landscape in terms of its Christian religions. In addition, the donation of a $5,000 check is obviously an exaggeration that heightens the humour, but it's not totally outlandish. Diaspora Greeks the world over raise staggering amounts of money to pay for their churches, halls and schools. These words then have been left as they are for the sake of this integral diasporic connection. Leaving in such words, though, is something else. It's a subtle attempt by me, a translator who fundamentally believes that translation is a political act, at acculturation. People are amazingly adept at transgressing the confines of their particular linguistic cultural group and to successfully interpret meaning from a suggestive context. Think about all the Greek words used by non-Greek speaking people in this country today. Souvlaki, spanakopita, yaya, papu, yasu, to cite just a few that came readily to mind. It is not just the immigrants who have internalised English words, transposing them to their own linguistic range and sensibilities. We would do well to remember that acculturation is not a one-way street. So, here is the joke, and I'll really try not to destroy it. But after all this, Stavros lived above his restaurant with only his beloved dog for company. One day the dog died, and Stavros went to the local Greek Orthodox priest and asked, "Pater, my dog has died. Could you do a trisagion for my beloved pet? He was like a son to me." Pater Mihalis shook his head. "I'm afraid not. We cannot have services for an animal in the church. There's an Anglican church a few blocks away, and God knows what they believe in. Perhaps they'll do something for your dog." Stavros said, "I'll go right away, Pater. Do you think a cheque for $5,000 is enough to donate to them for this service?" Pater Michalis exclaimed, "Kyrie eleison, why didn't you tell me the dog was Greek Orthodox?" So, and I've also got it there. I like this a lot, I have to say. I think that's the sort of joke that tells itself, you know. I have my reasons for saying that. In translating lives, issues pertaining, this is a book that came out several years ago. In translating lives, issues pertaining to biculturalism and bilingualism are explored by academics and writers of differing ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. What makes this publication poignant is the Australian experience. What makes this book groundbreaking is that the whole notion of objectivity within Australian letters is challenged. The subjective stance viewed as salient within these inevitably widened cultural parameters. And I quote, "The key to cross-cultural understanding is language. If the general lack of such understanding in Australia is to rise, Australians need to develop more of an insight into what it means to not feel at home in English, in a country where English is both the only official language and the only shared lingua franca. It is only exposure to other perspectives, those suggested by other languages, which shows us what we, as native speakers of one language, instinctively take for reality is in fact a particular interpretation of reality. Until recently, it was widely assumed in both scholarly literature and popular wisdom that valid knowledge can only come from the objective study of external reality. Because of this assumption, some subjects of profound human interest and of great social importance could not be explored in depth and discussed in wide-reaching societal conversations. As a result, some knowledge vital to society, especially to a multicultural one, was passed over in silence. Many scientists are beginning to recognise that a science of experience has to be based on subjective rather than putatively objective data. Monolingual scholars analysing bilingual and cross-cultural experience by objective methods are likely to be deluding themselves." End of quote. I think it is imperative to make the following distinction at this point in time. I consider myself to be bilingual. I have no tangible recollection of actually learning to communicate in English and Greek. The internalisation of the written symbols, the verbal utterances, the linguistic codes, the subtle nuances, the accompanying body language pertaining to each language is a process that is lost in the proverbial mists of time. I feel completely comfortable speaking, reading and writing in both languages. Not so with Albanian and French. I don't speak Albanian, although I enjoy listening to it, and I feel a certain nostalgia for the 60s and 70s when it was such a significant feature of Evian gatherings. My parents were from the island of Evia. Where am I? I studied French at high school and at university level. During the 80s, I used to speak it here and there with a colleague who spoke it fluently, but my contributions were rudimentary and stilted. In short, I could never refer to myself as a truly multilingual person. When all is said and done, English and Greek are inextricably linked with my sense of self in a way that French is not. Both Albanian and French are technically learned second languages. I do not take risks in these languages. I have no ability to self-correct, as my internalisation of them rests with the purely cognitive rather than the intuitive. Given then that my biculturalism and bilingualism inevitably inform all I do, it is hardly surprising that literary translation should become an enduring passion. Indeed, my fervent hope is that my research into Greek Australian literature and my translations of first-generation writers' poetry and prose into English ensures that the following stanzas by Dina Amanatidis should not prove prophetic. I die a little each day, knowing that what I write will never be heard, will never be read. Whatever I created was wasted energy. My inner treasure will be buried with me. In 1985, and I would like you please to note the date, 1985, nearly 40 years ago, the conference proceedings of a literary conference on multicultural writings were published, where A.C. McCormick had the following to say. Now finally, what of the question of translation here in Australia? We can't all be polyglots. We can't all learn to read and write in even a handful of the many languages alive in this country. So we must look to the translators, those who, following the Latin derivation of the word, carry us across. And presumably that means essentially translators into English, our common lingua franca. Translation here is making a vital contribution towards the realisation of an Australian multiculture. Precious little progress has been made in this regard. Funding for literary translation is all but non-existent. Now, it's important to make a distinction here. Translation for community languages, for literature written here, there is funding for translation into other languages, sending our literature outward, but not for our community languages. Prizes for literary translation are very, very scarce. Reviews of local, particularly post-war immigrant writers, when we do translate them into English, reviews are very, very scarce, and revisionist readings of invaluable past texts are virtually non-existent. Someone asked me once, why have you agreed to your doctorate being online? Don't you want to save it and, publish it? And no, because that is a huge revisionist reading document, and I'm ecstatic when people read it, and I'm beyond ecstatic when people use it. New translated works from the pens of writers from the myriad of ethnic groups that make up this country's extraordinarily diverse social fabric would infuse the present Australian literary landscape with new colours and perspectives. Arts administrators and relevant government ministers for the arts would do well to note that translation serves as a way of continuing to write and to shape language creatively. It can act as a regenerative source. It has often been noted that periods of intense translation activity in a culture are followed by a staggering flower of local writing content. This is exactly what happened during the English Renaissance of the 16th century, after the vast amount of translation undertaken during the difficult years of civil war in the 15th. But there's more to it than this. The stories written by first-generation post-war immigrants in the Greek language, whether poetry, prose, plays, are the only substantial historical representation of that first wave of post-war mass migration that we have. In the absence of formal avenues of funding, such transference across the cultural divides is relegated to that grey area of voluntary effort and the goodwill of a certain select number of individuals who are sufficiently passionate about it to work for nothing or for very little. I have translated enough poetry and prose by first-generation Greek Australian writers, both male and female. There are over 20 monographs. I honestly think there are several hundred poems that I've translated and short stories in various anthologies and so on. So I think that I can say, that I can state with conviction that such translation into English of Australian immigrant writings has the propensity to widen the parameters of this country's literary canon to a degree that would necessitate a completely different mode of discourse in critiquing it. At very least, it would necessitate an altered conceptual stance where cultural and linguistic diversity is at the absolute centre rather than being relegated to the hinterland of marginalisation. It is an oft-cited trope that reading translated works that were originally written in another country opens up the possibility of being introduced to that country's culture and therefore appreciation of other worlds. Reading Russian or French novels, for example, gives us an insight into other times and places. We get to know other countries and their people without ever having physically visited them. So much happened in the post-war immigrant communities about which most Anglo-Australians, particularly middle and upper class Anglo-Australians, who were not in close proximity with the day-to-day struggles of the working classes, know next to nothing. Given that the upper echelons of society bolster hegemonic structures, is it any wonder that to this day we are subjected to the monocultural societal reviews such as I have expounded above? The Indigenous people of this land feel this even more acutely. The indifference to their multifarious linguistic landscape seen as being, and I'm quoting Indigenous people here, seen as being almost as catastrophic in terms of eradicating their stories as the brutality meted out during the dark years of British colonisation. And this is a quote by me. Through translations of this country's Indigenous and immigrant literatures, an Australian readership would be afforded the dazzling possibility of actually getting to know itself. I would now like to present a kaleidoscope of snippets of translations that I have undertaken. The corpus of work now includes quite a lot of monographs, inclusions in anthologies, etc., and my doctoral research. I hope that this gives a glimpse into the literary quality of these works, their thematic range, and their propensity to fill in the gaps in socio-historical recordings. After this, I will close this presentation with a few words about a visual text that had a profound impact on me. I won't read them out, I'll let you read them, but I will read out the last one, and I'll explain why. So, this was the book by George Zangalis. I love the way George, I should be very careful. I shouldn't say God rest his soul, he'd be appalled, but you know, he really would be. I really would be. His most happy moment was, and I couldn't believe it, he called me comrade forever, when I told him that my husband and I got married in Greece first in a registry wedding. He said, "I love you," he said to me. So this was very special. This was shortly before he passed away. And yeah. This was one of the most moving things I've ever done. Litsa Gogas is 90 years old, and she finally managed to admit, after 9 decades, that she had been physically abused as a little girl in Greece by a benevolent uncle. She really wanted to write about it. She grappled with mental illness for many decades, and she wanted to write this book so that her grandchildren would know why she was sad a lot of the time. I grew to really love this woman and her sister Ioana very, very much. And I am very proud that this story is travelling widely. And it was published by a mainstream publisher, which had I been, I wouldn't have been as ecstatic as Litza being afforded that honour. She said that to me many times. Men would always dictate what I could and couldn't do. She was deeply hurt by that. This one, I love this writer. Chris Fifis is a superstar, of course, with these things. Chris collected all of Nino Laikis's works, and I translated a selection of his works. He wrote, he was very deeply affected by the plight of Indigenous people. As, by the way, I've just finished a huge body of research about post-war literatures in all different languages. It's going to be published by, it's part of a Cambridge History of Modern Poetry. And I've talked to people at the Institute as well. They're very excited to see an anthology of these works, and so that's being prepared as we speak. But you know, Jewish literature, Italian, Ukrainian, they've all written beautiful pieces. This was a labour of love again with my dear colleague Helen Nikas. We compiled this anthology, and this is Ioana Liakaku's piece. This was an interesting one. I was contacted by a man in Brisbane. He's phenomenally wealthy, phenomenally successful, and that goes against the grain, you know, for me. But he spoke so beautifully to me on the phone, and he had such humility. And I thought, well, just a minute, you know, it's his story. And he worked extremely hard, and he wanted to hand this biography, it was written by his brother, to his grandchildren. I was very touched that he didn't know any English at all, but they would point to the haircuts. What a clever way, you know, to do it. This is Dina Manatidis, whom many of you know. This is a tome. This has over 200 poems and scattered thoughts. Now this, whenever I hear people saying that these writers just talk about nostalgia, this is about Glen Waverley. This was dedicated to Glen Waverley. And very early on, it was one of her earliest pieces. That's where they live to this day. Now, this next one I'd like to say a few words about. Ekaterini Baluka passed away a couple of years ago, another devastating loss. Many of our writers have gone, as have so many thousands of people of the first generation, but amongst them the writers as well. Ekaterini comes from northern Greece, and they speak in a dialect. These vignettes about widows, they would go to Greece and the widows would pass by her house, and anyone who knows Ekaterini, if Ekaterini were here tonight, she would be hugging all of you. She was that sort of woman. Everyone was Dali, Dalimu, everybody. And so she wanted to write something to honour the women in Greece. And she said, I'm going to write this, but I'm going to write it in my dialect. This really, if my husband had agreed, this would have said, translated by Konstandina, Dounis and Christos Avramoudas. There would be no translation if it hadn't been for Christos. He translated it first into Greek, into beautiful modern Greek, because his Greek is lovely. And I then translated it into English. I would like to read you the next one because I feel as though I'm channeling our dear Katerina, because she was so beloved in our family. When my mother passed away, she said, that's okay, no more crying now. I'm going to bring you things and, you won't miss her so much. So they were very, very lascivious. And I remember when I first saw them, I thought, my goodness, this next one that I'm going to read is by Dimitra. And Dimitra's husband, late husband, was very cheeky and a womanizer. And so towards the end of the story, this is what Dimitra says. Anyway, I'll let you read it. I think it's better if you read it. It was very cute. They were very cute, I have to say. It was a lot of fun translating this. So, I'll go back to this, but I'd like to just put this image up. On January the 1st, 2011, on the front page of the Australian newspaper, The Age, there was a striking painting that reflected a happy amalgamation of a Michael Leunig cartoon with what appeared to be Australian Indigenous modes of painting. The resultant image was colourful and joyful, a rare occurrence for the front page of such publications that are usually filled with gloom and doom somewhere. This was the entire page. Leunig, who accompanied this image with a short prose piece, where he extolled the virtues of this particular painting style, intimated that he had learnt it through working with many Indigenous artists. He lamented the fact that more white Australian artists didn't paint using this method, although he did concede that this reticence was probably based on cautious respect. Even if Leunig had stopped at this point, I would have declared this to be a wonderful tribute to Aboriginal culture, and therefore a truly wonderful note on which to start the new year. However, what was written next deeply impressed me. We are told that the painting has a theme. Loosely, it is based upon what could be called, I'm quoting Leunig, a painting of Noura. I'll go back so you can see the words. Pronounced Noura, an important central Australian Indigenous word meaning homeland, my country, my place. Many Aboriginal paintings are simply entitled Noura and depict country, place, culture, animals and bush tucker plants, and the deep attachment to these things. Noura is a glorious Australian word. End of quote. That is, Leunig doesn't refer to Noura as a glorious Aboriginal word, but as a glorious Australian word. In those 6 words of the last sentence, he recreated for me a New Year's message like no other. Noura is indeed an Australian word. The original inhabitants of this land used language that conceptually encases it. There were other dimensions to this as well. dimensions focusing on actual etymology and phonology. That is, noura has a direct correlation to the Greek word topos. Both noura and topos are transliterations. The word topos, as it is used within the realm of literary theory, does not correlate to the primordial depth of the word in the original Greek. Noura constitutes a beautiful translation. My homeland, my country, my place. In the Greek psyche, the particular place of birth, the specific village, is at the very centre of any concept of homeland. Furthermore, the loveliness of the word topos in terms of its dissyllabic structure and repetition of the vowel sound is virtually mirrored by this exquisitely corresponding Aboriginal word. Henceforth, from that moment, in any research that I undertook, I use the word noura when I need to further elucidate the word topos from a Greek sensibility. To take Lunig's final assertion to its logical conclusion, any words used within this landscape by people who were born here or who are citizens here are Australian words. They may not be English words, but they can certainly be referred to as Australian. Of course, this is not a new concept. The appellation community languages, to refer to immigrant languages, in the halcyon days of multiculturalism in the 80s and early 90s, was an attempt to do just that. The Age is to be congratulated for printing this piece on the front page and on New Year's Day, thereby giving a large readership cause for reflection. And finally, words and their particular contextualisation are fundamentally important things. Theodore Adorno had famously said that for a person who no longer has a homeland, writing becomes a place to live. I love this quote in that it constitutes a reflection of the warmth and security that words can engender. To first-generation immigrants, primarily from a rural background, encouraged to come to this country by a government in desperate need of workers, factory fodder, the sadly apt phrase that is often cited by these migrants themselves, their new environment must have seemed unutterably alien. Is it any wonder that they clung on to their languages and their rituals with all their might? Words have a way of haunting you, of affecting your selection of them. They command respect. I grew up with the word diaspora being uttered all around me. The Greek accent is not on the first A, but on the last. There is no d sound in the first letter. The d sound is the Greek the. In Greek, the is as in the word the. In the Greek language, the word diaspora is powerful and poetical, thereby reflecting its intrinsic profundity, encompassing as it does migratory trends from ancient times. Diaspora is spoken about, sung about, danced to. As Mimi, Sophocleos and Salome well know, particularly when I worked at RMIT, I used to speak about diaspora all the time. I used to sing it and I used to dance it at the retreat. Every Friday I would go along there. Diaspora has an organic relationship with every facet of life. The migratory trends of the post-war years that saw the mass exodus of young men and women from their homeland is now being replaced by the ultimate exodus from this life to the next. Hundreds of thousands of these immigrants are in their twilight years. The specificity of the particular topos from which they hailed, their noura, has never been more strikingly signified for me than through the pages of Nels Cosmos in the death notices section. This is expanding constantly to the point where it now covers 3 to 4 pages and often more. And under each photograph of the deceased is clearly stated the particular small village from which they hailed. I don't know if the journey ends at this point. This is the realm of the mysteries. But I certainly know the fundamental truth of these beautiful words by Dina Manatidis. You become tied to a landscape when you've buried even one beloved person in its soil. Greek words translated into English words, radiating ancient sensibilities about landscape, about home. These words have survived labyrinthine voyages, have navigated their way through numerous transferrings. Their journey from their topos to their ultimate Nura has now come full circle. Thank you.